I didn't question my family's obsession with bloodlines until the DNA test arrived and shattered everything we pretended to be. Not slowly, not gently, but in one brutal revelation that turned our carefully constructed identity into a joke told at someone else's expense over a century ago. My name is Catherine, though my mother insisted everyone call me Catherine Ashford Montgomery, all three names pronounced with the kind of weight that demanded respect before you'd even met me. For 26 years, I believed our family was special, that we carried something rare and valuable in our veins, that our surname opened doors because of who we were, not what we'd done. I was wrong about all of it. Before I tell you how everything fell apart, take a second to hit like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. And tell me, have you ever discovered your family's entire identity was built on a lie? I grew up in a house that looked like old money even though we were barely holding on. A Victorian mansion in Connecticut, inherited through generations, filled with antiques my grandmother forbade us from selling no matter how desperately we needed the cash. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the hallways, crystal chandeliers hung in rooms we couldn't afford to heat, and every surface displayed some artifact meant to prove our connection to English aristocracy. My mother, Victoria, ran our household like a museum dedicated to preserving a legacy she claimed stretched back to the 1800s. She spoke often about our ancestor, Lord Edmund Ashford Montgomery, who allegedly fled England after a scandal and established our American branch of the family. The details were always vague, romanticized, the kind of story that sounded impressive without requiring proof. My childhood was filled with lessons about proper behavior, appropriate associations, and the importance of maintaining our family's reputation. My grandmother, Eleanor, was even worse. She treated our supposed lineage like a religion, complete with rules, rituals, and unforgivable sins. We didn't socialize with certain families because their blood wasn't pure enough. We didn't marry outside our social class because it would dilute the line. We certainly didn't question the carefully maintained family tree that hung framed in the library, branches extending back through centuries of Ashford Montgomerys who'd supposedly shaped history. I absorbed all of this growing up, wore it like armor. At private school, I corrected teachers who mispronounced our surname. At college, I joined the right clubs, dated the right boys, maintained the right image. When people asked about my family, I delivered the practiced lines about heritage and legacy, watched their expressions shift from casual interest to impressed deference, and felt that quiet thrill of superiority my mother had taught me to crave. Looking back now, I can see how toxic it was, how the pride we felt wasn't based on anything we'd actually accomplished but on an accident of birth we hadn't even verified. But superiority built on lies is just arrogance waiting to be exposed. The cracks started appearing when I was 24. My mother had begun planning my wedding to James, a man from another old family, someone she'd basically selected for me when we were teenagers. The engagement was expected, arranged in everything but name, and I'd gone along with it because that's what Ashford Montgomerys did. We married within our circle. We preserved the bloodline. We maintained standards. James was fine, handsome in a bland way, successful in his father's investment firm, completely uninteresting but entirely appropriate. Our engagement party was held at the country club, attended by the same families who'd attended every important event in my life, and I smiled through it while feeling absolutely nothing. The champagne tasted expensive and empty. The congratulations felt hollow. I stood in a room full of people who supposedly mattered and realized I didn't actually like any of them, including myself. That night, after everyone left, I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by furniture that had supposedly belonged to my great-great-grandmother and felt the first real flutter of doubt. Not about James specifically, but about all of it. The performance, the pressure, the constant monitoring of who we were and weren't allowed to be. My phone buzzed with a text from my college roommate, Sophie, someone my mother had never approved of because her parents were doctors, not descended from anyone important. Sophie had sent a link to one of those DNA testing kits with a message that said, "Let's find out if you're actually related to royalty or if your mom's been lying." She meant it as a joke. I ordered the kit that night without telling anyone. It felt rebellious in a small, safe way, like I was testing the boundaries of everything I'd been taught to accept without question. I didn't expect it to change anything. I certainly didn't expect it to destroy everything. The test arrived in discreet packaging 2 weeks later. I swabbed my cheek in my apartment bathroom, sealed the sample, and mailed it back feeling like I was doing something vaguely rebellious but ultimately harmless. I expected results confirming what I already knew, proving the family stories, maybe discovering some distant royal connection that would make my mother even more insufferable. The email arrived 6 weeks later while I was at work. I opened it during my lunch break, expecting ancestry percentages and genetic health risks, maybe some interesting migration patterns. Instead, I found a section that made my sandwich stick in my throat. DNA relatives. The list was long, but none of the names were familiar. No Ashford Montgomerys anywhere. Not one. I scrolled through dozens of matches, third cousins and fourth cousins, people with surnames like O'Brien and Murphy and Chun. Common names. Working class names. Names that had no business appearing in my genetic history if our family story was true. My closest match was a woman named Patricia O'Brien, sharing approximately 12.5% DNA, the amount you'd expect from a first cousin once removed or great-grandparent relationship. I stared at her profile picture, a smiling woman in her 60s wearing a Boston Red Sox cap, and felt the first real tremor of fear. This couldn't be right. There had to be a mistake, a contamination, something that explained why my DNA matched with people who had no connection to English aristocracy. I clicked on Patricia's profile and found she'd built out her family tree extensively. I traced the branches back, looking for any connection to the Ashford Montgomerys, any explanation that would make this make sense. Instead, I found a woman named Mary Catherine O'Brien, born in County Cork, Ireland in 1847, immigrated to England in 1868. Her daughter, also Catherine, was born in 1869. Father listed as unknown. That detail stopped me cold. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the Ashford Montgomery family tree my grandmother kept framed in our library, the one I'd memorized growing up. According to our records, Edmund Ashford Montgomery's wife Catherine gave birth to their first child, a daughter also named Catherine, in 1870 in London. Close, but not matching. The dates were off by a year. The location didn't match. I took screenshots of everything, my hands shaking so badly I had to steady my phone against the desk. Then I did what I should have done years ago. I started actually researching our family history instead of just accepting the stories. What I found over the next 3 hours made my stomach turn. Public records in England showed no Edmund Ashford Montgomery in the peerage, no scandal, no family fleeing to America. The name appeared exactly once in historical records, in a newspaper article from 1871 reporting a theft from Ashford Manor in Yorkshire. Items stolen included jewellery valued at over £2,000, silver candlesticks, and documentation belonging to the Montgomery family, including a family Bible with birth and marriage records. The thief was never caught, but the article noted a recently dismissed housemaid had disappeared the same night. Her name was Mary Catherine O'Brien. I sat in my apartment surrounded by printouts and open browser tabs, feeling my entire identity dissolve like sugar in water. Our family wasn't descended from Lord Edmund Ashford Montgomery. We were descended from the maid who'd stolen his name. The affair must have produced a child, the Catherine born in 1869, a year before the theft. Mary had probably worked at Ashford Manor, caught the Lord's attention or been taken advantage of, gotten pregnant and been dismissed. Instead of accepting poverty and shame, she'd stolen enough to reinvent herself. The jewelry funded a new life. The documents provided a new identity. She'd sailed to America as Catherine Ashford Montgomery, widow of the fictional Edmund, and built a legacy on a lie so audacious it had survived 5 generations. I felt sick. Then I felt angry. Then I felt something worse than either, a horrible creeping embarrassment at every moment I'd acted superior, every time I'd looked down on someone for not having the right background, every relationship my mother had sabotaged because the person wasn't good enough for our precious bloodline. I thought about Sophie, whose friendship I'd nearly abandoned in college because my mother said doctors' children weren't our kind of people. I thought about the boy I'd dated sophomore year, wonderful and kind, who I'd broken up with because his parents owned a bakery. I thought about every casual cruelty I'd committed in the name of preserving a lineage that didn't even exist. If you're finding this story eye-opening, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. And drop a comment telling me about a time your family's story didn't match reality. I called Sophie first, told her everything, and listened to her try not to laugh at the cosmic justice of it all. Then I sat with the information for 3 days, trying to decide what to do. I could keep quiet, let the lie continue, marry James and raise children who'd inherit the same false pride that had shaped my entire personality. Or I could tell the truth and watch everything collapse. The decision became easier when my mother called to discuss wedding flowers and mentioned, casually, that James's mother had expressed concern about some distant cousin of his who wanted to bring an inappropriate date to the reception. Someone who wasn't from their circle. Someone who didn't understand how these things worked. The disgust in my mother's voice, the casual dismissal of another human being based solely on their background, made my decision for me. I couldn't spend another day participating in this performance. I drove to Connecticut the following weekend, walked into the house I'd grown up in, and found my mother and grandmother having tea in the parlor beneath that damn family tree. They looked up when I entered, my mother smiling until she saw my face. The smile faded quickly, replaced by concern that looked more like irritation. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I pulled out my phone, opened my DNA results, and set it on the table between us. "We're not Ashford Montgomerys," I said. "We're O'Briens." My grandmother's teacup rattled against its saucer. My mother's expression froze into something brittle and sharp. "Catherine, what are you talking about?" Her voice carried that warning tone I knew well, the one that said I was crossing a line, venturing into territory that wasn't open for discussion. I told them everything. The DNA test, the matches, the research, the newspaper article about the theft. I watched my grandmother's face go from confusion to denial to horror as the truth settled over her like a shroud. She aged 10 years in those 10 minutes, her carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal genuine fear underneath. This wasn't just family history to her. This was her entire identity, the foundation of every choice she'd made, every relationship she'd controlled, every standard she'd enforced. My mother recovered faster, started arguing immediately. The test must be wrong. The records must be incomplete. I'd clearly misunderstood something because our family history was documented, verified, unquestionable. She pulled out her phone and started calling family members, lawyers, anyone who might help her build a defense against reality. "It's not wrong," I said quietly. "We're descended from a maid who stole a lord's name and jewelry after having his illegitimate child. Everything else is a story she invented to survive." My grandmother stood up so fast her chair tipped backward. "How dare you?" Her voice shook with rage I'd never heard before. "How dare you come into this house and spread lies about our family? About everything we've built, everything we are." "They're not lies," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "They're the truth. The lies are what we've been telling ourselves for over 100 years. Mary Catherine O'Brien was a housemaid who got pregnant, got fired, and decided to steal her way into a better life. She was brave and desperate and probably had no other choice. But she wasn't an aristocrat. And neither are we." The silence that followed was suffocating. My grandmother's breathing had gone shallow and rapid. My mother stood frozen, phone still in her hand, staring at me like I was a stranger. Then my grandmother slapped me. Not hard, but sharp enough that the sound echoed in the silent room. My mother gasped, reached for her, but my grandmother was already moving, already fleeing upstairs to her bedroom where she kept her own copies of the family documentation, as if looking at forged papers would somehow make them real. I touched my cheek, more surprised than hurt, and looked at my mother. She was crying now, angry tears that streaked her makeup. "Why would you do this?" she asked, voice breaking. "Why would you go looking for something to destroy us? We had a good life. We had respect. We had a place in the world. And you threw it away for what? For truth? What good is truth when it ruins everything?" I picked up my phone from the table and stood. "The truth doesn't matter," she continued, her composure cracking completely now. "What matters is what people believe, what we've built, the position we hold. You think anyone cares about reality? They care about the story. They care about the performance. And you just destroyed it." That moment crystallized everything wrong with how I'd been raised. The story mattered more than reality. Perception mattered more than truth. Our imaginary superiority mattered more than actual decency. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw a woman who'd built her entire life on a foundation of lies and couldn't survive without them. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said. "But I can't live like this anymore. I can't marry James and raise children in this same toxic cycle. I can't keep pretending we're special because of who we supposedly descended from instead of who we actually are." My mother's face hardened. "If you walk out that door, if you tell anyone about this, you're done. No inheritance. No family. No support. You'll be completely on your own." I nodded slowly, feeling strangely calm. "I know." I left that house and didn't go back. My mother called 17 times that evening, left voicemails that progressed from angry to pleading to threatening. She told me I was destroying the family. That I was being selfish. That if I told anyone, I'd be cut off from everything, disowned, erased from the family tree, just like I was trying to erase our history. I blocked her number after the third voicemail that called me ungrateful and delusional. Then I called James. He deserved to know before his family did, before the gossip started circulating through our social circle like wildfire. I met him for coffee the next day and told him everything over a corner table at a Starbucks that was definitely not the kind of place Ashford Montgomerys typically frequented. I watched his face as I explained the DNA test, the research, the truth about our family's origins. He was quiet for a long time after I finished talking. Then, quietly, he said, "Does this mean you want to call off the wedding?" "Yes," I said, realizing it as I spoke. "But not because of the DNA. Because I don't want to spend my life pretending to be something I'm not. And honestly, James, neither of us love each other. We're just doing what our families expect." He was quiet again, staring at his untouched coffee. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I've been pretending too. About everything. About wanting this marriage. About wanting any of this life." We talked for 2 hours, the longest real conversation we'd ever had, and discovered we barely knew each other. We'd been performing for our families, playing roles assigned before we were old enough to refuse them. He admitted he'd been seeing someone else, a paralegal at his firm, someone his parents would never approve of. I wasn't hurt. I was relieved. The breakup was mutual, almost friendly, the most honest interaction we'd had in our entire relationship. We sat in that Starbucks and laughed about how absurd it all was, how we'd almost committed to a lifetime of unhappiness because of family pressure and social expectations. Before we go further, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button if you're invested in this story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And comment below if you've ever had to choose between family expectations and your own truth. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. My grandmother suffered a stroke 2 days after my revelation and was hospitalized. The doctors said it was brought on by stress and high blood pressure, but my mother blamed me publicly, told everyone who would listen that I'd attacked a sick old woman with vicious lies designed to destroy our family. Some people believed her. The country club crowd, the families we'd socialized with for generations, they chose sides quickly. Most sided with my mother because the alternative meant questioning their own carefully maintained identities. But others started doing their own research, finding the same records I'd found, whispering about it at charity galas and garden parties. The scandal spread faster than I expected. Within a week, everyone in our social circle knew that the Ashford Montgomerys weren't actually descended from English aristocracy, but from an Irish maid who'd committed theft and fraud. The family fractured along predictable lines. Some relatives demanded we address the truth publicly, acknowledge the deception, maybe even try to make amends for the years of snobbery and exclusion we'd inflicted on others. Others insisted we double down on the lie, threatened legal action if anyone spoke about it outside the family, hired crisis management consultants to spin the narrative. My mother chose the latter. She hired a lawyer to send cease and desist letters to anyone discussing our private family matters, and began a campaign to discredit me as unstable, vindictive, jealous of my sister who'd married better and knew how to behave appropriately. My sister, Jennifer, called me once during this period, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You've ruined everything," she said. "Grandmother's in the hospital. Mother's having a breakdown. My husband's family is reconsidering our social standing. All because you couldn't keep your mouth shut about something that doesn't even matter." "It does matter," I said quietly. "It matters that we've spent generations looking down on people, excluding them, judging them, all based on a lie. It matters that we've hurt people in the name of preserving something that never existed. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think you're so noble now, don't you? So honest and pure. But you're just selfish, Catherine. You destroyed our family because you couldn't handle living up to expectations. You never could. She hung up before I could respond. I'd never been close to my sister anyway. She'd chosen to stay in the fantasy, and I couldn't blame her entirely. It was easier, comfortable, safe. Her entire life was built on the same foundation mine had been, and she had children now, a husband whose family valued lineage as much as ours did. Acknowledging the truth would mean dismantling everything she'd built. The DNA test didn't just reveal where we came from. It revealed who we really were when stripped of the pretense. And most of my family, faced with that truth, chose to retreat further into the lie. My mother launched a full-scale defensive campaign. She hired genealogists to find any possible connection between the O'Briens and actual aristocracy, no matter how distant or dubious. She had the family tree professionally reframed with new documentation that conveniently omitted the problematic gaps. She gave interviews to the local historical society about preserving family legacy and the dangers of modern technology disrupting traditional records. She was convincing because she believed it herself now, had convinced herself that my DNA test was flawed, that the newspaper article about the theft was about a different Mary Catherine O'Brien, that our family story was intact despite all evidence to the contrary. Watching her perform this elaborate denial was both fascinating and heartbreaking. I moved to Boston about 6 weeks after the initial revelation, started over in a city where nobody knew the Ashford Montgomery name or cared about bloodlines and social registers. I got a job at a nonprofit working with immigrant families, helping them navigate systems designed to exclude them. The irony wasn't lost on me. My own ancestor had been an immigrant, desperate and resourceful, who'd done whatever it took to survive in a world that offered her nothing. I rented a small apartment in a diverse neighborhood, made friends who asked about my personality instead of my pedigree, dated people my mother would have rejected immediately for having the wrong background or skin color or accent. I started introducing myself as just Catherine, dropped the Ashford Montgomery entirely, and watched how differently people treated me without the aristocratic surname. They were warmer, more genuine, less guarded. It was like I'd been performing behind glass my entire life and had finally stepped through to the other side. I reached out to Patricia O'Brien, my DNA match, about 3 months after moving to Boston. We met for coffee at a diner near her house in Dorchester, and she greeted me with a hug like we were already family. She was warm, funny, completely unbothered by the dramatic revelation that had destroyed my family. "Honey," she said, laughing when I apologized for the awkwardness, "you think you're the first person to find out their family tree has some creative branches? My husband found out his grandfather wasn't actually his grandfather. These things happen." She told me about our real ancestors, the O'Briens who'd survived the Irish famine and immigrated to England looking for work. She showed me census records, passenger manifests, employment documents that painted a picture of poverty and resilience. Mary Catherine O'Brien had worked as a housemaid from age 14, sent money home to Ireland to support younger siblings, lived in a servant's quarters that she shared with 6 other women. The affair with Lord Montgomery, if that's even what it was, might not have been consensual. Patricia was careful about that, said we'd never really know, but the power dynamics suggested something darker than romance. When Mary got pregnant, she was dismissed immediately, left with no references and a child on the way. The theft happened 6 months after her daughter Catherine was born. She took enough to start over, to buy passage to America, to create documents that would give her daughter a chance at a better life. She did what she had to do, Patricia said, showing me a photo she'd found in a family album. Mary Catherine O'Brien, stern-faced and unsmiling, holding an infant in a simple dress. Was it right? Maybe not. But she was 22 years old with a baby and no options. I can't judge her too harshly for taking what she needed to survive. I kept that photo. Not because I'm proud of the theft, but because Mary did what she had to do in a world that gave her no other options. She wasn't noble. She wasn't a victim. She was complicated, pragmatic, willing to build a life on a lie because the truth offered her nothing. I understand that now, even if I don't agree with what it became. What started as survival for Mary had become superiority for her descendants, and that transformation was where the real tragedy lived. Patricia introduced me to other O'Brien relatives, dozens of cousins I'd never known existed. We started having monthly dinners, big chaotic gatherings where people talked over each other and laughed too loud and nobody cared about proper table settings or which fork to use for salad. My mother would have been horrified. I loved it. These were my people, my actual family, and they were nothing like the cold, performative gatherings I'd grown up with. If this story is resonating with you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear about choosing authenticity over appearances. And let me know in the comments, what would you do in this situation? A year after the DNA revelation, my grandmother died. The stroke had left her partially paralyzed, and she'd spent her final months in a rehabilitation facility, still insisting to anyone who would listen that our family's aristocratic lineage was intact and that I was a liar trying to destroy everything she'd built. I attended the funeral but sat in the back, uninvited to the family gathering afterward. I watched my mother perform grief for the assembled relatives and friends, watched her maintain the story until the very end, and felt nothing but a distant sadness for the life she was still clinging to. My mother gave a eulogy that painted my grandmother as a guardian of tradition and family values, conveniently omitting how those values had been used to exclude and demean anyone who didn't meet arbitrary standards. The estate sale happened 3 months later. The Victorian house sold to a young family from India who loved the architecture and planned to renovate it completely. My mother was furious that those people had bought our family home, and her racist comments during the sale process were the final nail in whatever relationship we might have salvaged. Everything inside sold too, piece by piece, the antiques that weren't actually family heirlooms, the furniture my grandmother had claimed came from England but had probably been bought at auction in the 1920s. I attended the sale out of curiosity and bought one thing, a small portrait of a young woman in a maid's uniform that had hung forgotten in a back hallway. Nobody else bid on it. Nobody else cared. But I looked at that painting and saw something in the woman's expression, a quiet determination mixed with barely concealed anger, and I wondered if it might be Mary Catherine O'Brien. The portrait hangs in my apartment now, in my living room where I can see it every day. I'm not certain it's Mary, but something in her eyes makes me think it might be. Real or not, it reminds me that identity is something you choose, not something you inherit. It reminds me that survival sometimes requires desperate measures, and that the line between victim and villain is often blurred by circumstances we can't fully understand from a century's distance. 2 years after the DNA test, I'm living a completely different life. I work at the Immigrant Resource Center, helping families navigate the same systems that once would have excluded them based on background and origin. I have friends from every possible background, people my mother would have dismissed as unsuitable but who are more genuine than anyone I knew in the country club set. I'm dating a wonderful man whose parents immigrated from Vietnam. He's a teacher, passionate about education equity, and he makes me laugh in ways I didn't know I was capable of. My mother would absolutely hate him, which honestly makes me love him more. I introduced him to Patricia and my O'Brien cousins, and they welcomed him immediately, the way family should. We don't talk about bloodlines or social standing. We talk about real things, difficult things, honest things. Last month, I got a letter from my sister. Not an email or a text, but an actual handwritten letter delivered to my apartment. She's getting divorced, she wrote. Her husband's family had indeed pulled back after the scandal, and the marriage had been strained for months before he finally admitted he'd only married her for the connections her name supposedly provided. With those connections gone, so was his interest. She didn't apologize for how she treated me, but she asked if we could meet for coffee. I haven't responded yet. Part of me wants to reach out, to build something real with the only sibling I have. But part of me remembers how quickly she turned on me, how easily she chose the lie over the truth over me. I'm not sure forgiveness comes that easily, even for family. Maybe especially for family. I've learned that blood doesn't obligate you to accept mistreatment, and that sometimes the healthiest choice is distance. 3 months ago, I did something I never thought I would. I legally changed my name. Not dramatically, just quietly, at the courthouse on a Tuesday morning. I'm Catherine O'Brien now. It felt right, claiming the name that's actually mine, honoring the woman who made desperate choices so her daughter could survive. I'm not pretending Mary Catherine O'Brien was a saint. She was a thief and a liar, and the consequences of her choices rippled through generations. But she was also brave and resourceful, and she refused to let circumstance destroy her daughter's future. My name is Catherine O'Brien, and my family claimed we were old money descended from English aristocracy. The DNA test proved we were descended from an Irish housemaid who had an affair, or maybe wasn't given a choice, who got pregnant and got fired, who stole her employer's name and jewelry and sailed to America to build a new life on a foundation of lies. For 5 generations, my family maintained that deception, used it to justify cruelty and exclusion and superiority we had no right to claim. I didn't break my family by revealing the truth. It was already broken, built on a foundation too fragile to survive the weight of reality. I just stopped pretending it was whole. The hardest part wasn't losing my family's approval or my inheritance or my place in a social circle that never actually cared about me. The hardest part was realizing how much of my own personality had been shaped by the lie. How many people had I hurt with casual snobbery? How many relationships had I dismissed because someone wasn't from the right background? How much of my life had I wasted performing for people whose respect was worthless because it was based on fiction? I can't undo those years. I can't apologize to everyone I looked down on or judged unfairly. But I can live differently now. I can choose authenticity over appearance, substance over status, real connection over performed superiority. I can raise my future children, if I have them, to value character over pedigree, to judge people by who they are rather than who they're descended from. I can be the person Mary Catherine O'Brien might have been if she'd been given real choices instead of impossible situations. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family stories or the lies we tell ourselves to feel special, please subscribe to this channel and share this video. Drop a comment telling me about a time you chose truth over comfort. And remember that your worth isn't determined by your ancestry or your bloodline or your family's reputation. It's determined by who you choose to be today, right now, in this moment. The truth didn't destroy my family. It revealed what was already there, the rot beneath the polished surface, the emptiness behind the elegant facade. And yes, the revelation was painful. Yes, I lost relationships I'd thought would last forever. Yes, I sometimes wake up in my small Boston apartment and miss the comfort of that big house in Connecticut, even knowing what it represented. But I also wake up knowing who I actually am. Not Catherine Ashford Montgomery, descendant of imaginary aristocrats. Just Catherine O'Brien, descendant of a desperate woman who did desperate things, trying every day to be better than the lies I inherited. And somehow, impossibly, that's enough. Thank you for listening to my story. If you made it this far, you're amazing. Hit that like button, subscribe for more real stories about identity, family, and finding yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.